I want to do a quick little video, kind of just to help, myself, understand, my current, not even issue, just today's issue, but also something that I really, just now realized after being profitable for, recently the past like month and a half, and I really haven't seen, this type of information kind of explained step by step. So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of just get straight into it. So trading is hard, yes. Everyone who decides to start trading, they sit down, they look at charts, and they start to learn a setup. They look for a profitable setup. They want to see X, Y, Z happen. This can be ICT concepts. This can be support and resistance. This can be Bollinger Bands. This can be EMAs. This can be anything. And in my situation, it's ICT. So from day one, you learn the concepts. You sit down, you learn what you have to learn. In my case, it was ICT concepts. TGR helped me out way in the beginning, and then I finally, once I graduated from TGR, I moved on to ICT, went over all his mentorships, and started processing this information. And all the while I'm doing this, I'm trading and I'm being involved in markets, but I'm not necessarily profitable. I'm just getting a feel for these concepts, understanding how they work, how to identify them correctly, because it's one thing to see it, your mentor show you a concept, but it's another thing to build your entire trading system, which is kind of what I'm getting into, based off of those concepts. So day one, you're learning the concepts, and then this concepts that you go over creates your narrative. The narrative is the most important trading attribute or thing you could possibly have. Narrative. If your narrative is lost, then your bias is going to be most likely skewed, as well as your setup will most likely be skewed, leading you to be unprofitable or take trades that are not there, or maybe they're there but you're just early, you're late, something's up. So once you learn your concepts, you have to dive into narrative, and narrative takes a lot of time. Narrative is basically why the market moves where, and exactly why it does it. So if I go to today's example, narrative on the day is, bias on the day is bullish, but the narrative for the morning session is to come down, sweep into this 50-minute order block, and then move higher. So the narrative on the day is bullish. So the narrative is bullish on the day, but the earlier narrative is bearish. So once that concept gets hit, boom, which is this order block, our whole bias, that's when we start to validate our bias. So our narrative now ties into our bias. So if we're pushing down, which the market has to go down before it goes up in this situation. So think of narrative as a prerequisite to bias. In order to have a bias, you have to have your narrative. And the narrative for the morning session was come down for the low, and then eventually, sweep out sell side, take this internal liquidity, and then move higher. So what does that mean? My narrative is, yes, we're going to come down, but then we're going to go up, so that leads me to a bullish bias on the day, and then I can go into that bullish bias, and then now I can look at my setup, which is a completely different thing from bias and narrative. So basically then, once your narrative is understood, where price wants to go for a certain reason, say it's liquidity, it's internal liquidity, external liquidity, it's consolidating, or I forgot what Justin Werland had a very good 4 points of liquidity. It was inefficiency, liquidity, consolidation, and then one more. I really can't remember, but that's besides the fact. So once your narrative is clearly understood, your bias, which is the way you want to place a trade today, is then decided. So back to the situation, the narrative, yes, we were bearish going into the morning session, but that helps me with my daily bias of us being bullish outside of on the larger time frame, on the daily time frame. So that's how your narrative kind of decides your bias. And then after that bias is decided, your setup will present itself in not way in the way, but in the way of your bias. So say my bias is bullish, I'm looking for a bullish setup. I'm not going to be looking for shorts. So once again, narrative first, which is the most important thing. You have to know why the market's moving where for what reason. Once you identify why it moved there, that's when you can build on your bias, and then your setup finally presents itself. So you notice how the setup is at the end of the these three points. The setup is, yes, it's one of the hardest to master, and that's kind of where your edge of profitability comes from, is by mastering your setup and continuing it over and over and over, and then refining it, which is what I've done. But then if your bias or narrative is wrong, your setup does not matter. This is a great example of today. So my narrative was wrong. Which I thought we would be bearish, so that impacted my bias to make me bearish in order to take a bearish sell setup, if that makes sense. So basically allowing yourself to find a good narrative will be good. You're good for the rest of the day, and that's the hardest part in trading. People are looking for their setup. Yes, they're looking for the setup, and it might be there, but their narrative is wrong from the get-go, so their bias is immediately wrong, and that's exactly what happened today. This reminds me of back in the day when I would trade my setup, and I would be surprised by the fact that I'm losing, but the only thing I was missing was narrative. So the kind of key thing I'm getting at is the narrative is the most important thing in trading, and you can't overlook it. If your narrative is mixed, you shouldn't be trading, and it's that simple. I remember ISD was very on that. However, you can tie in your narrative into your setup. So basically, if the narrative is right, then bias backs the setup in any situation. So say I did want shorts, and my narrative was right to be short to internal liquidity, and I could have taken this short. If I go back to here, I could have taken this short into this order block, took profit at a 1 to 2, about a 1.5, doesn't matter, took profit into this 2-minute order block. That's the narrative. Because remember, if my narrative is right, which I'm bullish in the day, my bias will be taking longs. So that automatically eliminates every sell setup I could think about. However, if you want to be overachieving, you can identify these smaller moves. So actually, I'll go to a better example on NQ instead of going here. So this is okay, great example. The narrative on the day is the narrative or the bias is essentially bullish, but your narrative needs to go, needs to be down before you go up. We need that manipulation. So if you look up here, we have this buy side sweep. We then get a fair value gap right here, and then we get another fair value gap right here. So this right here is a order block. We break structure. We don't touch it. And we react off this breaker block right here and this double fair value gap, and we react to the downside. This is not the right narrative trade. We want to be looking for longs on a day like today after FOMC, after filling in that fair value gap. So we are trading against the narrative, the bias, but the narrative is what we're trading with. Remember, narrative over bias. Our bias is bullish on the day, but our narrative is telling us we want to go lower before we go higher. So this in turn allows us to take these sell setups, which is not a part of our bias, it's part of our narrative, and then once X, Y, or Z is hit, which is this order block in this situation, all these SMTs, we then move to our actual bias. So our narrative on the day is bullish, and now our bias on the day, our narrative for this is bearish. Once we tap X, Y, or Z, our narrative turns to bullish. Hence now our daily bias will play out, and the setup that we're looking for will be able to find.
I know you're making a video, but I just seen a squirrel eating a mushroom. That motherfucker about to be tripping.
No way, he's about to be tripping. Basically, the narrative will tie yourself. The narrative don't basically tie yourself to bias. It's all about narrative in this situation. So in the morning session, we had that dump, and then once we tap our order block, you can see price turns into, basically market reversal. Order block, come above propulsion block, and then go higher. And then that's your narrative, bias, and your setup playing in all together in confluence, wherever it's at. I don't know where it's at, but yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. And then finally, I just want to get into one more thing of the fact that your narrative, your bias, all that stuff can be can be spot on. But if your emotion, and basically what impacts your internal state, such as greed, FOMO, over leveraging, etc., like, just basically being not a smart trader, you're not going to be profitable. You can have the right narrative, the right bias, the right setup, but you will not be able to be profitable consistently long term because of the way your internal state or emotions are. And that's a really big thing to overcome. A lot of people get stuck. They learn the concepts. They're starting to understand narrative, why the market moves, and they still haven't mastered the emotional aspect of trading it, and that's what's going to hurt more than help. You can have everything spot on, but as long as that's not right, then it's not right. So say, for example, today my narrative was completely wrong. I had everything that was everything I wanted to see happened to the short side. My narrative was just completely wrong, so the setup will be invalidated according to the bias. Your narrative is X, your bias is this, your setup is another thing. I was completely invalidated. However, did I break any rules? No, I didn't. Did I risk according to what I was going to risk? Yes, I did. Did I over leverage? No. Did I FOMO? No. I could have FOMO'd in. At the right over here. I saw this entry to the upside, and I was thinking about taking it. I was gonna accept about $65 more of risk, but I said, that's no point. I'd rather just accept this loss and then I let price continue without me. Just because of the fact that when you say that, your brain is really building that those connections in order to not be emotionally unstable in that sense. Yes, for example, say a good trader could have risked slightly less on the first one, got stopped out, and then re-entered long as a result of getting invalidated. However, I had max risk on the day, so there was no there was no reason for me to enter, other than just accepting the fact that my narrative was wrong, and that led to my bias being wrong, and that led to my setup being wrong. So yeah, that's kind of what I just want to get into. And it's kind of tough. Narrative is hard to understand. It takes a long time, but that is basically the key to understanding the market. You can have your setup. What exactly. I know my exact setup. I know exactly what I need to see. But in this case, why didn't my setup work? Well, it could have worked to an extent, but it didn't work down to my not my ultimatum, but to my maximum point where I thought prices was gonna go, because of the fact that my narrative and bias were wrong. So yeah, that's kind of really all I gotta say. And there's one more thing I was gonna go over about bias and narrative. Well, the reason I kind of am going over this is because this is kind of the only the last kind of issue I'm facing. Not even really an issue. It's just a losing day based off a losing narrative is pretty rough. Usually days like this are pretty easy to identify. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce those ideas in my brain, and basically understand clearer. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope that helped, or something maybe clicked. But yeah, this is mainly just a mental reminder for myself, just to understand that narrative is over everything. And yeah, remember, you're not going to be a consistently profitable trader if your emotions and the way you trade is not ordered. You need order. You need your risk to be completely laid out on the table. You need to know everything what you're doing going into the market. And yeah, and also one more thing, I did right around this point where we came low here and we had this SMT, I'm thinking, I'm pretty mixed bias. My narrative, isn't all the way right. It doesn't feel right to be bearish with these SMTs. So when it doesn't feel right, it usually doesn't mean it's right. So that's all I really gotta say. That's it. I will see you all tomorrow. I just want to go a little quick over thing with that, and yeah, y'all stay safe.